Hi everyone. In previous weeks, we've been talking about examples of hostile design. And I wanted to re-evoke this as we start today. So a bench like this it's not immediately obvious, right? Who has designed this bench, what kind of users they are inviting to sit here, and probably more importantly, what kind of users are being repelled from sitting here. This was something we sort of had to dig into and understand the way, for example, that street furniture is being designed today to invite and also discourage certain kinds of users and certain kinds of uses. So we've been talking about this with urban design. And today I want us to sort of make a link to the design that we find online, whether that's apps like Uber or Twitter, or interfaces like Facebook or Google. We generally think of these, we take them for granted. They're part of our everyday life, and we don't really look at them as designed objects. So much as we sort of brought a new kind of scrutiny to bear on this sort of bench that you're seeing in this slide, I want us to think today about some of the online platforms that we use all the time, and think about what design features are built into those, and whether those also have a way of inviting certain users to participating while discouraging others, and what sort of ideas about what are appropriate uses and what aren't are built into the various digital media that we use. So probably a really clear example of this is one that Mike Montero brought up in Ruined by Design. He talked a lot about an app called Grayball. And this was a version of Uber that was delivered to targeted users. They were obviously collecting data on all users, but if users were located near the address of certain municipal buildings in a given city, or using, for example, a government-issued credit card to pay for services, that would flag that user as a potential enforcer of rules around Uber. So in municipalities that actually didn't allow Uber, like Portland, Oregon, these kinds of users, instead of being served the normal Uber, they would be served a version of Uber known as Grayball. And this looked like Uber, right? You would see, for example, a map that gave a pin with your location. You would see cars circling in your area. You could even select rides, but they would always cancel. And this was actually, so it's an entire ghost version, essentially, of Uber that was delivered to targeted users who they thought were likely to be either officials from City Hall or law enforcement officers. And they used it to evade detection of using their app in places where it wasn't permitted. So this is a pretty, I think, clear example of designing an app to do something illegal. It's literally designed to evade law enforcement. And Montero singles this out as an example of bad design, right? Of something that would not be a good idea for you as a young coder to participate in this initiative. So in a place like that, I think it's really clear to see, okay, this maybe is this effort this code is being written for a purpose that's illegitimate. It's worth pointing out that no one actually inside of Uber thought that this was a problem. This project went forward. But in fact, if you look at the online entities that we use every day, various kinds of social media, for example, Google is really the example we're going to be looking at in this class. Once you understand that all of these actually consist of lines of code that are written by humans in the best way that they can to serve certain kinds of purposes, and in some ways to just ignore other possible purposes, or to frustrate or discourage them, it's not that hard to see that they're actually not any more neutral, for example, than the city furniture that we've looked at. You just have to be able to look at them in the right way in order to see the choices that are being made by the designers who create them. And this becomes more difficult, I think, when we're dealing with the online world for several reasons. One is just that these are more and more complex artifacts. The ways in which they work are not necessarily particularly clear to the average civilian. And so it can almost seem as if the whole thing is too complicated and we'll never figure it out, so let's not worry about it, right? I think it can feel overwhelming when we consider, for example, how Google works. The other thing is that we are not privy to actually how Google works, right? Its algorithm for search not only is being constantly tweaked and changed, but it is proprietary. It is a corporate secret, right? So it is not something that we can study and evaluate from the outside. We're not allowed to look at the code. And not only are we not allowed to look at the code, we also don't have much access into the social processes. How many people are on a development team for a particular initiative? How are those teams composed? Who's in charge? How is the agenda for what the team is doing set, right? Those kinds of processes are also largely hidden from view as corporate secrets, and we're not particularly privy to those sort of social decisions around the making of code. So what we're actually left with, if we want to understand the design decisions, is looking at how an algorithm performs, what it does, right? So we don't really have knowledge about intent or the nuts and bolts of how these are made, but we can look at what they spit out, right? So when we look at search, for example, we can see what we get back. That is, at the moment, our only real way of evaluating these algorithms that are incredibly powerful and that control enormous parts of our lives. So that's what we're going to be talking about a little bit today. And I want to situate this sort of in a historical viewpoint, which is in the very early days of the web. And this is a famous cartoon from 1993. What people thought about the web being good for, and this is like Web 1.0, was that it was a space where you could be somewhat freed up from your actual identity. Okay, so on the internet, nobody knows my age, they don't know my gender, they don't know my name, right? And so I can be free to explore maybe parts of my identity that I've always been curious about, but have never found a way of exploring in real life. So this idea of nobody knows you're a dog, right, was seen to be this moment of freedom, right? So that you could be free from the sort of rules that would govern in-person interaction, and able to explore not only aspects of your real self, but even to create entirely fantastical personalities that expressed wishes or desires. So the idea is that it was a kind of the hope was going to be that it was a sort of social utopia, where all of the sort of rules that we have inherited and learned about appropriate categories that we dwell in could be kind of exploded. And there was a sort of a euphoria around this idea. Now, when you look at actual reports of this time, however, and this is a sort of a memoir by a guy named Mark Meadows, you can see that actually what gets kicked up when you imagine that you're in this fantastical rule-free space is not a completely new imagination, but a set of inherited images that you have learned throughout culture. So if you think about the images he's describing here in these avatars, and he's I think feeling he's in this utopian mode when he's describing this. He's saying, okay, I'm looking at a page and here are the avatars I'm seeing. And they're this range of things. And some are heroes, some are objects, some are body parts, some are natural things like lightning, but others are things that never happened. You don't actually feel, in my view, looking at this in retrospect, like you're in a purely fantastical space. You almost feel like you're looking at images from mass culture, right? Like a large-breasted woman, or a dancing pig, or a weird remix of Adolf Hitler eating a watermelon, right? There's plenty within this, I think, that actually suggests that you're looking at an imagination, a certain person's imagination, or a certain group's imagination based on a stock of cultural images, which in fact do not equally invite everyone to participate, right? But that suggest a certain group is being invited to play in this supposedly free space. And I think this comes out even more clearly when he describes an early chat on America Online. So this was a very early dial-up way of accessing the internet. And this is before you even have visual avatars. You have a 6-character name that he's describing as his first avatar. And he describes how he doesn't think, he just is inspired, and he types in pighead. And the reason why it's misspelled is because he only has 6 characters. And he starts going around the chat rooms in AOL as pighead. And these chat rooms have actually topics that AOL is offering to organize the discussions. So there's a sort of an architecture. There is an explicit set of rules about what you will do on AOL. Well, you might want to talk about sex, or you might want to talk about cars, right? So there are these sort of existing categories. And what he's describing is creating his own conversations by looking at people's names and finding other people who, like him, had chosen pig-themed monikers to use AOL. And so they start creating this kind of unofficial group, right? It is not, they don't have a chat space within AOL. AOL is not anticipating this. So there's this kind of freedom that he feels really excited about by affiliating with these other pig-related people on the basis of the avatar. And how he describes how what they would do is they would show up in a chat room that was ostensibly about some other subject and then just start making these jokes, sort of like juvenile sex jokes and just dumb jokes. And as you can see, he describes the purpose of doing this as annoying the other users so much that no one else could participate. So the hapless Jill 433 just flees the chat room, right? And how his excitement about the freedom that he feels to affiliate with other people who want to make dumb jokes about pork is actually, repelling other users. And in fact, they some of them were tossed off for violations of the user rules. And what he doesn't seem to be aware of, right, is the fact that his utopia here, his freedom to just make these dumb jokes, right, is coming at the price of denying other people the chance to have their conversation, which he thinks those conversations are ridiculous because they're docile, right? Because they're within the lines of what AOL is suggesting, whereas he has figured out a way to sort of game this system and create this other conversation within this sort of embedded architecture of topics. So I think when you look at a memoir like this, and there are many, many examples, what you can see is that this supposed, freedom to be whoever you want to be ends up being a rather specific demographic that is experiencing the freedom, and everybody else is kind of experiencing that freedom as a kind of harassment, right, or unfriendliness. And if you think about where this has gone with Web 2.0, and of course now even more intensely with social media, right, you can see that the right to, and of course the jokes have gone beyond pork products, right, into things that are very hateful on the basis of gender, on the basis of race, on the basis of ethnicity, on the basis of language, right? You name it. There are very, very hostile opinions brutally expressed toward others. This freedom that we were supposed to have has actually been the freedom for a very few people to kind of take over the system and amplify this kind of hateful speech. So that freedom that we were hoping for hasn't really played out that way. And in the readings for this week, I think you'll see sort of a range of different ways in which the fact that the internet, by and large, has been produced by a certain kind of young, relatively affluent male who more often than not is white, has showed up in numerous ways. That is not only sort of the normative user of the internet, but that is also, by and large, the coder is something that you can now see the results of that everywhere. But again, it can be hard to see it if you're not knowing where to look. So I think that hopefully these articles will help somewhat. So this particular case comes from 2016, where the idea was that there would be a beauty contest that was judged by AI, right? So the issue with an AI, of course, is that AIs learn by studying human culture. And when they study human culture, they are essentially learning the biases of already existing culture, right? So what gets tagged as beautiful, what gets valued as beautiful, the AI learns that. And so the creators of this AI are horrified to discover that they had all these winners and all these categories, and only one of the finalists out of 44 had visibly dark skin. So how could that be, right? Because this is an algorithm that we wrote, and it should be pure of racial prejudice because it's just code. Code doesn't know race. Machines don't know race. So Ruha Benjamin is trying to explain this, and she quotes the insight that the simplest explanation, right, is that humans have bias, and that bias is they're often unaware of that bias, right? So it's sort of something that they aren't aware of as they create the code that will do this, and they can truly be shocked, let's say, at the outcome. And Benjamin offers one, a sort of set of thoughts about this. So one is that that people writing code are part of human society, and that therefore they've been schooled in racism since birth, as we all have, and therefore that's going to show up in ways that they're not even aware of in how they're writing their algorithms. The second is that we're now generating this massive data set of human choices that show, right, that deeply reflect these biases. And that's the data set that things like AIs are drawing upon to learn, right? So that's going to be another place where it's introduced. And as a possible solution, Benjamin says, well, one possibility would be to make sure that design teams are more inclusive, right? And that isn't going to remove any of this, except it's going to make it more likely that there are some people who are capable of seeing it and flagging it for everyone else, for whom it's just going to seem like common sense. And we'll come back to this at the end, this idea of inclusion in programming and in coding as a way of helping to address this problem. Okay, so it's I think easy to look at something like a beauty contest and say, all right, well, who cares, right? And I think it's any individual case can be dismissed on its individual merits. When you look at the pattern, though, of these AIs, you will see that it is not just one team or one corporation that is creating biased algorithms, right? So another example also from 2016 is the example of a chatbot that Microsoft created called Tay, which essentially was a Twitter personality that they put on Twitter. It was an AI that was going to learn from the interactions that she had on Twitter. And it took 16 hours before she was making the most profoundly hateful and nauseating statements toward every type of, every minority. There were horrible things about Jews and Holocaust denial and racist stuff. And I mean, it literally took less than 24 hours for her to become making these really horrifying statements. So you can read the conclusion that the MIT Technology Review draws from this, which was, this was a great lesson. This is an object lesson about how not to do an AI, and here's what we need to do instead. That's one way to look at it. The other, and the other is to say, wow, if AIs are learning from us, they're going to learn all the worst of us as all the best, as much as all the best of us, right? They don't know how to discriminate between these different parts of human culture. So it's a real issue, and I think it's worth going back and looking at the Vint Cerf speech that I recommended for last time. This is his concluding line. It's interesting, I think, to see what in 1999 he thought were the huge issues. A lot of what he is talking about is access to the internet and saying that it is inherently universal, and yet it's not. So he's talking about digital divide issues, which is if you cannot get onto it, or if you cannot get onto it reliably, you are excluded from something. And it's going to have huge impacts on your future. And so part of what he's calling for at the very, and this is his concluding line, he's saying universality is not a given. It's a goal, and we have to be vigilant about trying to ensure that people have access. But this is also a question, right, of access, because even if you technically have access, if you're being pushed out of communities, Gamergate is a good example. Being told that you don't belong and that your voice is not valued, no one wants to hear what you have to say. That isn't really access either, right? So that question of inclusion, I think, is a really, truly problematic one. And I want to also just make a transition. We're going to be talking about this week and next week. The fact that algorithms don't just live online. It's not just a question of whether you lose a beauty contest, right? Or have an unpleasant interaction on Twitter, right? I don't know, how important those things are in the grand scheme. I tend to think they're fairly important. Other people may disagree. But there are a host of real world effects, in real life effects that flow from these kinds of algorithms as well. And these algorithms have the same biases implicit within them, both on the level of the initial coding and on the level of the data sets that are being used to inform the decision making of the algorithm. They build in the bias of the society. So you can read an example also from MIT Technology Review about a medical algorithm that was persistently essentially ranking discomfort or health issues of white people, ranking those as more important than the same level of issue for Black people. How did that happen? That the problems with that algorithm are discussed in that piece. Another example I'm going to talk about at the end. I mean, these are everywhere, but the algorithms are now used for various things in criminal justice, and they have the same problems. So this is a place where it's not just about who gets to feel welcome in a conversation or who is being treated poorly or abusively in a conversation, right? The impacts go well beyond that. So for your assignment this week, I actually want you to take a look at the Google homepage and read this, to give yourself the opportunity to think about this as a piece of design that communicates certain things about what Google is, what it's up to, what it's doing. And then to compare that with a reading that talks about Google from a more critical perspective. This is called The Hidden Logics of Search. And what he's talking about is that search is extremely important. Search, you can think of it, well, this is just how I find the things I need. But in fact, what shows up in search and what is excluded, what order they show up, that's all subject to this proprietary algorithm that we have no information about how it's being used. So he looks at a number of sketchy cases where he talks about the fact, if you don't show up on a Google search, it's as if you don't exist, right? So the power of that is much more important than this window would necessarily imply. He raises essentially the same thing we could say about the bench. The bench appears objective and neutral, right? It appears to just exist, and it doesn't appear to have any particular point of view, right? But we saw how there was point of view in that bench and how it was created. And the same thing is true in search. It is not objective and neutral. He goes through these 4 areas. So what I'd like you to do is just pick one of these, maybe skim through them. It's quite a long essay because he's really talking about each issue in depth. So pick the one that you're most interested in and think about how it relates to the visual and semiotic analysis that you did. I also just wanted to mention in passing a connection with the ethics of design assignment that you guys did a great job with. Google used to have, as part of its mission statement, a phrase. It became very famous for this phrase, and it's actually a kind of a variant of the Hippocratic Oath that Montero suggests using. So if the Hippocratic Oath is do no harm, Google used to say in its official corporate literature, don't be evil. So this was removed from its mission statement in 2018, which many onlookers thought was noteworthy. So now the Google mission statement you can see here. And again, it attempts to create a very neutral, straightforward mission in place of a much more complex statement. So you can read a little bit more about this in the article. Google itself, one of the things about it, of course, is that that interface has changed over time. And if you're interested in this, you can look at this link and see some of the different versions of what the homepage has looked like. In 2008, Google began to suggest results. And this is actually what the author Sophia Noble is talking about in her piece that we're reading this week, which I highly recommend to you. She describes how she was visiting her nieces and how she wanted to, they didn't know anything about the internet. She is a media scholar, so she wanted to show them, wow, there's all this great stuff where you can learn about your history. And she was imagining sites that would have empowerment, history, activities for Black girls. And so she typed Black girls into Google, and nothing but porn spewed back at her. And it was a shocking moment for her where she realized that Google was very much assuming who she was as a user and serving her up exactly what they thought she wanted, and that clearly she was not the user that was being imagined when she made that search. And so actually now, if you search Black girls, that no longer happens on Google. And I believe that that's the direct result of Sophia Noble's piece. That actually shows, I mean, I guess it depends on how you look at it. Defenders of Google would say, well, that shows that Google learns from its mistakes and corrects problems when they arise. But it also shows that Google's perfectly capable of altering the algorithm, or, in certain cases, it is going to override, right, the way the algorithm typically functions. I've now hit that search a number of different times just to see if it would change, and I'm really getting the same results in the same order. So I believe that they are now serving what Sophia Noble would like to see when you type in Black girls. So I guess the porn users have had to figure out a slightly different search to get what they're looking for. But what that suggests, right, is that they're perfectly capable of manipulating their results on a micro level to achieve whatever goals it is that they want to achieve, but we don't know what those are 9 times out of 10, right? This is an odd little place where we actually sort of do know or we can guess at and infer what might have happened. That now we get results that have to do with empowerment of Black girls. And in fact, what we actually get is a site called Black Girls Code as the first one. I'm going to come back to that in a second. So Google is not neutral. And one way I think you can actually see that is to know that these same two guys, right? So Larry Page and Sergey Brin initially called their site Backrub, right? Which sounds kind of like a nerdy sexual joke, right? And I think is, right? And fortunately, someone told them to ditch that name. It had to do with the way that their algorithm actually works, which is to look at how many pages a given page links to, right? And to study the quality of those links. So the more linked to a page is, the more trusted it is within the Google algorithm. So backrub is also a way of describing that, but it's more sexualized and sort of suggests a horny, nerdy coder a lot more than Google does. So in some ways, right, that name kind of tells you where they're coming from. Fortunately, they got rid of that because it's hard to imagine that would have gone quite as far as this more neutral, mathematical sounding, sort of silly, happy misspelling of a mathematical term. But in any case, right, that culture is still the dominant culture of Silicon Valley and of all of these products that are being created. So this is where I would sort of draw together what Ruha Benjamin is saying in terms of the need for diverse teams who are working on these algorithms so that some of these problems can be caught in development rather than actually having to let them become public and create these really catastrophic results before being corrected. Hopefully we could do a little bit better in product development than that. And that one way to do that, right, is precisely to actually draw new people into this profession, right? So that rather than it being important how diverse we are in these fantasy avatars, it really actually matters who we are in real life and the diversity of the perspectives that we can bring to these design teams. So the fact that Black girls code now shows up as the #1 result for Black girls, I think is actually really important to correcting that problem, because this is a group that has not been encouraged to see themselves as part of any kind of tech community. Not been, I'd say it's scarcely better for women of other races. If you read some of the exposés coming out of Silicon Valley written by women, they're very bad. But African American women are not, even in that group. And again, it isn't just about how limited our imaginations are. It actually has to do with the tools that we're building to run our society. So I wanted to share with you this recent study that was done actually by the federal government that evaluated 200 different programs for facial recognition. Okay, so a huge number of facial recognition software programs, right? That's not a small sample. That's many, many competing entities creating facial recognition software. What this National Institute found was these results that you see on the screen here, which again, I've taken from MIT Technology Review. You can see the link here. What these facial recognition software, none of them were good at identifying Asian faces or African American faces. Asian, African American, and Native American faces, algorithms designed in the US were consistently bad at matching. And the worst false positive rates, right? So the problem with these bad matching, again, you could say, all right, so these surveillance technologies are not very good at recognizing African American faces. But what happens is you get false positives. So a computer tells you there's a match. There's a lot of authority in that. Computer says there's a match, right? You can arrest someone on the basis of that. It's an authoritative result, but guess what? They're not right? So if you look at number 4, the worst false positive rates were for African American women, right? Which again is a group that is not included in any kind of tech development. And the result of that is you can be falsely accused, right? This computer result can be used to mess up your life in a pretty significant way just because it can't recognize you. And why can't it recognize you? Because the person writing the algorithm doesn't know who you are and doesn't really care, right? And because the data sets that are being fed into these also have biases, right? So certainly putting people on the teams to develop this software is only one measure that we need to do to improve, but at a minimum, we really need to do that. So we'll be talking about more real-world impacts of online decisions, but that's where I want to leave this lecture for today. Okay, thanks, guys.